seconds.
Okay.
So, good afternoon if you happen to be in Fire Island as my guests are today. You see, I have two guests. I'm Fred Plotkin. I'm in Manhattan in New York City, and this is the latest edition of Fred Plotkin on Fridays. And regular visitors know that I tend to have wonderful guests who inspire me. That is the common denominator of how I ask someone to join me. Sometimes there are people you know, often there are people I think you should know. And if you don't know Mark Campbell, I want you to meet my friend Mark Campbell. And who is that with you, Mark?
This is Finley, Sir Finley Giles.
Finley Giles.
He's crashing the interview to do you want to sing, Finn, for the opera audience? See, it's pretty easy. Okay, that's it. I'm going to put him away.
Mark, I had in September the wonderful baritone bass Luca Pizzaroni, and Luca loves his dogs, and his dogs love him. And one of the dogs is a dachshund, and that dog has made appearances at the Salzburg Festival in Le Nozze di Figaro as the dog of the Count, and has a very public personality. Tell me about Sir Finley.
Oh, I think he's very private. He really doesn't do interviews, but he has appeared on pretty much every Zoom call I've been doing. And people ask to see him. I don't think they're really interested in talking to me anymore. I think they want to talk to Finley. He's just a great dachshund. I grew up with dachshunds, so I love having him out here on Fire Island, and he loves it here. And it's just great. I had a corgi for a number of years. He died in 2011. And it was very difficult to get another dog. Finley is now 3 years old.
So there's a Mozart aria that I'm going to rephrase, Corgi Amor. For people who don't know Mark Campbell, I think of him as the Lorenzo da Ponte or the Metastasio of 21st century opera. Every opera, almost every opera, I would say, requires libretto. In other words, the words. And when people say to me, there's no good contemporary opera, opera is dead, opera is a museum art form, I quickly answer, not with names of composers and singers and directors, though I could do that. I start by saying Mark Campbell. Mark being a librettist who, the last time I checked, you have written libretti for 36 operas. Or has that changed since last week?
It's 38. I'm starting on my 39th. Yeah.
Very good. And 7 musicals, 5 song cycles, and 2 oratorios. Did I leave anything out?
No, 2 oratorios. I'm about ready to start on my 3rd.
Very good.
Yeah.
So what I want to talk to you about today, Mark, primarily, is not so much how you began, though we can discuss that, but the art of making a libretto. Because I think that in our modern times, the opera libretto has a very different role than it did in the past. And the reason primarily, and I think it's a mixed blessing, is what we call supertitles, subtitles, projected titles. In other words, much more of the opera-going experience in the past 40 years has been based on reading, has been based on words. And I think it's a bit unfortunate in certain cases that the preparation that people do to go to the opera has changed somewhat. By that I mean, when I wrote my book, Opera 101, projected titles were new. And I encouraged my reader, the subtitle is A Complete Guide to Learning and Loving Opera. It's not appreciation. It's how to become an opera goer and why opera is so meaningful and why it changes everything in life if you love opera, as I love opera, and I believe you love opera. And at that time, I had my reader read the libretto ahead of time. If there was a recording of the music, listen to the recording. There were not downloads and Spotify, and especially Adagio, which is what we're speaking on, and all these Apple Music and all those, but especially Adagio, in which one can listen to the music. It's great to listen to the music, but I teach, my background being a stage director in opera, I teach how to become a stage director in your mind. If you read the story, the synopsis, if you read the words, if you listen to the music and draw dramatic clues from all of that, you, the opera goer, or me, the stage director, could have visual imagery of what happens, how it happens, what the people look like, what their makeup is, what their costumes are, what the lighting is. All of that comes out of the libretto if you give specific indications, or if you simply say, give me your hand. Is that my ring? Things like that, that are action in an opera or in a piece of theater, but nonetheless, we don't picture them in our minds. And I kind of feel that with the arrival of projected titles, that people have become, I won't say lazy, but they've reprioritized their approach to opera. They become readers in the opera house and not listeners. And when I want people to really get into opera, I ask them to listen to the words and the music. Now, yes, often it's hard to make out the words, and we're listening to the music. But have I said anything you agree with, disagree with, in terms of how opera has changed and how we should approach opera?
Well, I wouldn't, I mean, the titles are one part of how opera has changed, and in a way, I feel tilted toward the libretto, for better or for worse. I think, and that's the librettist speaking. I don't like titles as part of the theatrical experience. I think most people feel that way. Most people on the inside feel that way. However, I also have been in many experiences where a composer has written information that the audience needs to hear way beyond a soprano's range, and that means the consonants drop out. And that means that the audience gets lost and they don't know how to go from point A to point B. Now, that's not just the composer's fault, because the composer obviously found something emotional in that moment that needed to explode in that operatic way we love. So I tend to advocate for titles because I want the audience to enjoy the music and not to be going, what did they just say? I'd rather they just kind of like, I mean, the best titles in the world are the Figaro system, the one that Santa Fe has in the Met, where you're watching like that and you can just check. The titles I don't like is when they're projected across people's faces and on the apron, and they're bigger than the set. And I've been in many situations where I've had to say, the titles are too big. All I can do is read the titles. I want to see the singers. I don't want my words are brilliant, absolutely, but I don't need to see those words. I want them sung. I want them. I want the actor to project the emotion in them. But there's an opera as one that I wrote with Laura Kaminsky, and Laura's written a beautiful score for that opera. And I've seen it performed with titles and without. It's better with titles. An audience has a better experience with the titles, because this is a story about a transgender person, and they're already—
Mark, if I may, as one will be a major part of our conversation, but I want to put it aside for a bit later because it's something I want to talk to you about in great detail.
Cool, but let me just finish my thought.
Okay.
Which is that the audience is already feeling a little bit uncomfortable because it's about a transgender story, and it's about a transgender person, and they don't necessarily know anything about a transgender person. And so the titles in one way helps them get the information and they're less scared. So that's my feeling about titles.
When I teach opera, I typically point out the fact that in most cases, a composer writes music based on an existing libretto and responds to the meaning of the words and also the sound of the words in creating the music that he or she composes. There have been exceptions such as Hector Berlioz, Richard Wagner, Stephen Sondheim, who write the words and then the music, and sometimes they write the music and then the words. You will tell me about Sondheim, but I think that somewhere in his creativity, the words and the music tend to flow together, whereas Wagner wrote the texts before and then composed to the text that he had written. But in the great majority of cases, a composer receives a libretto and works on the libretto and creates music that provides inspiration for him or her. And I think that part of your great success as our, I'm going to say it, leading librettist in the opera world right now, you are. I'm an expert, so I know that stuff. As our
I'm
leading
not, but
librettist,
I can name other.
there are many fine ones. I
tremendous.
agree.
Okay.
There are many fine ones, but you're the one for me. And that's why you're on this show and not someone else.
Thank you. I'm flattered. Thank you.
But what I find very notable in your libretti and your work is, number one, I'm very aware in the best way that you seem to know the music of the person you're about to work with. And what I find in your libretti is both a specificity to the composer you're working with, but also an awareness that there are so many different ways to tell a story in an opera. And part of why your libretti really work for me is that you work that in. There have been many fine librettists, wonderful librettists, who write beautiful poetry and rhyme and use florid language, and it results in florid, gorgeous music by Donizetti or Bellini or Gluck or some of the others. But that's opera from a different time. Your operas, and I'm going to name some of them, and you can name any of the ones that you want, are mostly about now, even if they're based in history. And I've seen some of your operas that are based in history or based on plays from centuries ago, whereas others are as real as today and about issues and ideas and emotions that relate to our time, but are perhaps timeless. So how do you prepare to write a libretto when you know who the composer is you'll be working with?
I listen to their music as much as I can. I'm in this business because I love music, and I do not mind disappearing into the music. I think a good librettist and a good libretto, it's about the music. We're here, you know how I feel about getting credit for my work, so I'm very strong about that. But a good opera for me is where the libretto is there, it provides the structure and the information, and it gets the audience from point A to point B. It points where they're supposed to look, but it's the music. It's the music that creates the emotional story. And that's why we love opera. But I listen to, you know, like Mason Bates' music is very much different from Laura Kaminsky's or Paul Moravec's or Kevin Putt's or Bill Bolcom's. And I've worked with like 30 or 40 composers. I spend a good deal of time listening to the music of each composer before I work with them, because I want to bring out their strengths. You know, listening to Kevin Putt's music, I remember this violin concerto I heard, and I said, wow, this is a great melodist. He knows how to extend a melody. I want to make sure that I don't get in the way of that. Someone like Paul Moravec, who is just a complete genius to me. I mean, like, and also a great collaborator. We challenge each other when we collaborate. It's really quite an extraordinary collaboration. On our last oratorio, there was a point where he said, I'm not sure you quite found the heart in this one, the way you did the first time. And ordinarily I'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? I know where the heart is, blah, blah. And he was right. And I went back and we rewrote this whole section that is just going to be like, it's going to be devastating whenever we get to have that performed. But it is all about the music for me. If otherwise I would have been a playwright or a screenwriter and made a lot of money.
How do you, for example, let's take Kevin Puts, who you worked with a couple of times, and most famously in the opera Silent Night, which is a modern masterpiece that won the Pulitzer Prize for you and for him, which is our highest honor. And how do you, if you know that he's a great melodist, how do you choose, fashion your words? Do you have longer sentences? Do you have more vowels? Talk about the process.
Well, unfortunately, we write in English mostly. I mean, Silent Night is in 5 languages, and we always try to aim for as few consonants as possible in English. It's not always easy, but I would say brevity. Brevity is always good in a librettist. We just need to. I think it was T.S. Eliot who, when he taught his poetry students, said, "I want you to use as few words as possible." I really adhere to that, and that goes across the boards. In fact, Kevin, Mason, even Paul have come back to me and said, "Can you give me some more words?" And it's a great honor to be told that, but or to be asked for that. But I really do believe that fewer words is better. Also, I mean, this is a strong quality of my librettos, I think. I stay away from florid poetry, or I try to use as simple language as possible. I'm trying to communicate something. And not everyone who rides the subway, or who lives in New York City, or everyone we deal with, not everyone sounds like a poet. We have poetry in our language, but it's usually based in a simplistic, simple way. And I don't mean simple and stupid. I mean simple and human, and in a direct way. And I love poetry. I read poetry. I read poetry to inspire me, but I don't ever think that I write poetically. And I'm very suspect if I write something, I go, "Oh, wow, who are you trying to imitate here?" Yeah.
You and your characters that, let's take, for example, Dinner at 8, which was a very famous comedic film, and you wrote it with the really wonderful composer, William Bolcom.
Mm-hmm.
These are characters, each with a lot of personality, a lot of backstory. It's such a well-known film that anyone who loves cinema knows half the movie already and has ideas about the characters. Do you, in the case of Dinner at 8, how much did you draw from the source material, and how much did you make it your own words to tell the story in an operatic way? And if you would define for me what an operatic way would be as compared to a cinematic way.
Well, Dinner at 8 is actually based on the play, but the play is very similar to the movie. The play is very long. It's in 5 acts, I think. And so the first thing I do is, okay, is this going to be a 2-act opera? Where is the break? Where is that moment at the end of Act 1 that makes everyone want to come back and see what happens? And so I took a number of events that are in the play and put them and just join them all together at the end of Act 1, so that we can take full advantage of the opera form in having many people sing at once. You can't quite do that with a play and make it work. In an opera, we love when he's singing about that, she's singing about that, they're singing about that, and they're fighting. And the audience is not really paying attention to the words. You've established what's going on, so they know what's going on. They just like to see people screaming at each other. They like to see that beautiful chaos that opera can do. And so that was one of my first decisions with Dinner at 8. I also knew I was working with Bill, and Bill loves writing I don't want to say show tunes because they're not, it's vocal music. But he loves show tunes. He loves the American idiom in music. And so I wrote something, I was careful not to write in a show tune way because it's opera. And I didn't want the audience to think, oh, why isn't this a musical? I didn't want that. So I found something in between. Gosh, I don't know what else makes it opera. I was so guided by that story and the characters. What some people don't know about that opera or about that play is that it's actually really serious. It's there's a suicide. There is marital infidelity all over the place. Unhappy marriages everywhere. I don't think there's a single really happy relationship. And there's financial ruin, and there's a man with a fatal disease who's dying on stage. And yet it's a comedy.
And literary criticism.
Yes, it's true. That was fun to write. I love working with Bill. He's such a tremendous composer.
He is. When I looked down the list, and I didn't write down all 38, 39. I wrote down some 36. You really have worked with a huge cross section of our leading composers. And I'm going to interject here and interrupt myself by saying that we have an international audience for these conversations, and many people listen in Europe. And I think Europeans and people elsewhere in the world know that America does have a cultural life that is a serious, very vibrant cultural life, and not simply trash culture that we've been witness to, especially in the past 4 years, but very serious, vibrant, artistic life that goes back to the beginnings of our country. This is not a cultural backwater. We are, more than any country in the world, a mix of races, peoples, languages, food traditions, musical traditions. The fact that just in my city, New York City, which is your city too now, we have a huge Latino presence, a huge African-American presence, a huge Irish presence, a huge Jewish presence, many more. All of these peoples I just mentioned have incredible musical and theatrical traditions, and they all blend here in phenomenal ways. It happens in Chicago in different ways, and with gospel music and so on, in Los Angeles, in New Orleans, where you have lived. All over the United States, we have these vibrant cultural communities that no amount of governmental intervention or ignorance can do anything to stop. Mm-hmm. And if anything, it promotes art and creative expression in difficult times. You and I are conversing in the middle of a pandemic, and it happens that today have been the most deaths and the most hospitalizations in the history of the pandemic in the United States. So it can be pretty dire. But nonetheless, I want people to know that when I introduce you to Mark Campbell, who is an American who works mostly in the United States, although his operas have been seen elsewhere, we have someone who's part of a modern movement, a modern cultural movement in the United States, and is a voice in the modern cultural movement. Dinner at 8 is a history play in a way. You also wrote an opera with a composer, Ian Bell, called Stonewall. Now, if I remember correctly, you live in Greenwich Village when you're not in Fire Island, where we find you today, because that's where you go to write. Right. But Greenwich Village is where the modern gay rights movement began in the United States. Stonewall, for people who don't know, was and is a bar, the Stonewall Inn, I believe it's called, where in 1969, in June of 1969, the patrons of that bar just were fed up with the constant harassment and police raids and so on, and they rioted. And they were led by drag queens, and it was an awakening. The coverage in the media at that time was, even in the New York Times, which claims to be a more decent paper than the New York Post and the New York Daily News at that time, used language that nowadays we would consider absolutely intolerable in
Absolutely.
terms of describing the men and the women who were in the Stonewall Inn that night. President Barack Obama declared the Stonewall Inn a National Historic Monument, and some of the people who were involved in that riot 50 years ago still survive. Did you speak to any of them when you did your research for this libretto?
Um, I spoke to one person, now I'm forgetting his name, forgive me, who was like an expert on Stonewall. There is a lot of information out there, fortunately. I wish that I had been able to speak to, you know, Marsha Johnson, all the, you know, I wish I had. I did get to speak to Stormy, I never pronounced her last name correctly, briefly, because she probably went by he or they at that point, was the bouncer at the, I've been in New York so far, I can't even, I'm so long, I can't, Hudson, but the bar on Hudson, right around the corner from where I live, lesbian bar, and what's the name of it? Oh my God. Anyway, they were the bouncer there for a long time. So when I used to walk my corgi, I would say hello and everything, but not about Stonewall. And apparently, Stormy was the person who probably threw that first brick.
Mm-hmm.
Although we don't know. Yeah, of course I did my research. You have to do your research and then you have to throw it away. Because the audience isn't there to understand your research. They don't care about they don't care about those facts. They care about a story with characters that they want to learn something from. So there's not a false moment in Stonewall, but it's my imagined version of it.
There are operas that have been defined in a way that I don't define your operas by, but I think you and our listeners will understand what I mean. They're called CNN operas.
Right.
In other words, they're ripped from the news and attempt to be a telling of what happened on those, whether it was an assassination, you name it. But in recent memory, where we who attend the opera will have seen newsreels, news footage, interviews, not history such as the Civil War in the United States, for example, which no one is around to still tell the stories of. We don't have newsreels, we have written documents, we have photographs, but not the kind of thing where we might have seen it on CNN and then watched it. Stonewall could have been that. I'm glad that it wasn't. But what I found so riveting in that opera is that you captured the spirit of the time. From what I know of it, I was a child, but I know people who were involved in the Stonewall activities. But you also captured the emotions and you captured the time. In other words, it was 1969. So the costume design, which was not your doing, evoked 1969.
You don't know that. No.
Well, I'm guessing. But it evoked the time, but it didn't exaggerate. It was not the Village People, for people who know that reference I'm making.
Yeah.
It were people who were dressed slightly strangely, and I don't mean eccentrically, but I just mean that the clothing didn't quite fit properly. It was very perceptive in terms of how they were presented. These were people who tended not to have a lot of money, the characters, and therefore didn't dress that way. There were a couple of government people undercover who were wearing suits that were very 1969. And so all of that flavor was invested in it. I don't recall who the stage director was, but it was very beautifully directed.
Yeah, I mean, I was about ready to credit Leonard Foley. Gave us
Leonard
the most
Foley,
brilliant production.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could have done the opera without him. He also gave me terrific advice on the libretto. I sent him the libretto before I sent it to Ian Bell, because we had to write that thing really quickly. And also I want to credit Michael Capasso and New York City Opera for having the vision to do that, to create an opera about Stonewall. I think is kind of amazing. If you looked around at the time, other opera companies were saying, oh, well, we're gonna, you know, we'll do something that's gonna celebrate this, and we'll have some soprano sing this song. But New York City Opera actually commissioned an opera about that event. And they gave us, I love that cast so much. I miss them. We formed a family, that cast, and yeah, I loved working with Leonard on that. And
I'm laughing because I just remembered something that I forgot or suppressed. Michael Capasso, head of New York City Opera, asked me to do a lecture, a talk between the matinee and the evening on the Saturday. And it was to members of a gay synagogue, LGBTQ synagogue. And the rabbi, a woman, was there, and it was a wonderful discussion. I, a week before, went to the Stonewall Inn because I'd never been there. And I thought it would be important to get the visual and look inside at it. The day after going to the Stonewall Inn, flew to Italy for work. I had a very quick job in Milan. And I came home, I went to the bar, I think on a Sunday, I flew to Italy on a Monday, landed on a Tuesday, came home on Friday, and had to see the afternoon, the matinee performance on Saturday, and then do my talk. And then I wanted to stay for the evening performance after my talk. And I ran into you before the evening performance, and I was so incredibly sleepy and jet lagged. And I said to you, Mark, it's not you, but I'm going to fall asleep in your opera tonight. I don't want you to think, because I'm known in New York, and if people see Fred Plotkin sleeping at an opera, that goes out on Twitter.
Yeah.
I wanted you to know ahead of time. And I did. I was fully awake for the afternoon performance. But it was interesting having my eyes shut for the evening performance. I wasn't really asleep, but I was not fully focused. So what I heard in the evening performance were the words and the music. I didn't see what I knew happened in the afternoon. And I didn't snore. The person I brought was instructed to elbow me just in case, but apparently I didn't snore. But it was very interesting receiving that opera twice in a day, the first time viewing it and listening and watching, but the second time only hearing it with my eyes shut. And it was very powerful that way, I got to tell you, because then I really got the words and the music. And if people are fortunate to be able to go to operas more than once, especially in a compressed period of time, what sometimes is a good thing to do is to shut your eyes and to really activate the hearing and make opera an oral as in listening experience. And so it was very particular. I've never seen the same opera twice in a day. And I've never done that exercise before or since, but I remember that you were very kind because I warned you that it would look like I would be sound asleep. I was not quite. I was not present, but I was not fully
I was
asleep.
just happy to see you there.
Well, of course, I
No, but you always bring like this, you bring this energy with you when you walk into a room, and it's always happy to see. I'm always happy to see it.
Thank you. I believe in positivity. I believe in kindness. And this actually is it's a very interesting transition. And I didn't mean the word transition, but you'll get what I'm saying.
I know where you're going.
Talk about as one, but in a different way than you might have been expecting.
Okay.
My favorite contemporary writer died last week. Her name was Jan Morris.
Oh, yeah.
And Jan Morris, and I'm getting goosebumps as I talk about her, was to me, a singular person in the history of writing. There has never been another author like Jan Morris. Briefly, to tell her story, she was born in, I believe, 1926 as James Morris in Britain, and was Welsh, and was the person who, as a journalist, reported the ascent of, suddenly saying Mount Rushmore, the highest mountain in the world. You know what I mean. Everest, thank you. I was going to say Kilimanjaro, all the wrong mountains. Mount Everest. It was James Morris who reported the ascent of Sir Edmund Hillary on Mount Everest in 1953. And he got the scoop. And he said that it was the greatest day of his life as a writer, as a reporter, to have gotten that scoop, which had to be relayed down the mountain and transported by cable to the Times of London, where it was printed. And it happened on the same day that Queen Elizabeth became Queen of England. And so it was a very historic day. And I came to James Morris's writing because one of my great loves has always been Venice. I was a Venetian history major primarily because I wanted to work in opera, and opera was not born in Venice, but grew in Venice. We wouldn't have opera without Venice. And there was a book that I was handed as a kid called Venice by James Morris. And it was, we all talk about books that changed our lives. That was one of the 2 or 3 books that changed my life. And I also loved his writing. And so I started going to the library in New York. We had and have wonderful librarians. And if they find someone who's genuinely interested, they help you find more books on the topic. So I read everything by James Morris, from his Mount Everest writings all the way up to the book that came out every year, until 1972. And in 1972, I went to the library. I was 16, and I said to the librarian, "There's no James Morris book." And she said, "I don't know why, but when there is one, I will let you know." And a couple of years later, she got in touch and she said, "I know you've been waiting. There's a new book, and I want you to come in. I'd like to talk to you about the new book." And she sat me down, and you could only talk quietly in the library. And I was still a teenager. And she said to me, "We have a new book by your favorite author." And she put it in front of me. And the book was Conundrum, which means a puzzlement, a challenge, a thorny situation, by Jan Morris. And she said, "Do you know what this is?" And I said, "Well, probably she's related to James Morris." And she said to me, "This person who wrote it was the person who was James Morris." Remember, this is 1973, 74.
Right.
Discussion of what were then called transsexual or sex changes and so on were hardly part of the public dialogue. And even in very progressive New York City, in a library with a teenager, had to be addressed in a way that was understandable and also understanding, which I think is an important distinction to make. And the librarian did it perfectly. And she said, "I want you to read this book. This is not advocacy. I read it before giving it to you. It is a person's life." And the librarian said, "Think of it as a travel book."
Oh, that's exquisite.
Yep. And so I read it about, the phrase now is this person's journey, which is a very hackneyed phrase. But at that time, I viewed it as James's journey to Jan. And what I took away from it were many things, but one of them was that he always was Jan.
Yes, absolutely.
But he was, to borrow a phrase from you, before Jan and then after Jan, or as Jan. And I read this book. I didn't understand everything. I will say that the delicacy of her language about the actual operation was accomplished in a page and a half, and it was not about the surgery.
It's not, yeah.
It was about identity. It was about who I am as an individual. And then the miraculous thing about Jan Morris to me was that he was a good-looking guy, and as a woman, she was a slightly frumpy, and as she got older, woman who looked like a traditional middle-aged British woman, and kind of dressed that way with occasional hippie tendencies toward tie-dye. But basically, when she was traveling in the Muslim world in Spain under Franco, she would dress in a more discreet way.
Mhm.
And what is among the many unique things about Jan Morris was that as a rugged, handsome young man with a square jaw, he could go to Cairo and Morocco and Seville and Sydney and Manhattan and engage in the population and be engaged by the population as this good-looking young guy with a very prominent jaw.
Mhm.
But then, as a middle-aged woman who let her hair go white quite early, she was treated as a middle-aged woman and came to understand these places, these cultures, these values through the fact that she was being treated differently as a woman,
Yeah.
but also that it gave her access to the conversational and emotional intimacy of women. I'm not saying sex. I mean that women spoke to her woman to woman
Mhm.
in a way that in those, especially the Muslim societies, they would never have spoken to a man that way. So Jan
Absolutely.
Morris uniquely was able to report on and describe these places two ways in her lifetime. And I wrote to her when I was, I guess, in my 30s to acknowledge how much she had meant to me. And I said to her that I would love to meet you sometime and have a meal. And she wrote back, and she told me that a few years later she would be in New York. We did have a meal. I plan to write this article sometime about my lunch with Jan Morris. And we kept in touch. And I had published a book called La Terra Fortunata about Trieste, the city of Trieste in northeastern Italy, and the region around it. And she had not written about Trieste, and I sent the book to her, and she wrote back very kindly, and she said, I'm in an awkward position because I didn't tell you that I'm writing what I think will be my last book, and it will be about Trieste.
Oh my God.
And it was called Trieste and the Meaning of Nowhereness. And she apologized for writing a book about Trieste. I said, I'm thrilled that you're writing a book about Trieste, a place I love. But the title was, and the meaning of nowhereness, that there are places in the world that capture one's identity and that express one's identity and where we find our identity. And you and I were talking about this before we went on air. And for Jan Morris, it was Trieste, because Trieste was under the Habsburgs, under Yugoslavia, under fascist Italy, under everywhere. And it was both in the center of things and nowhere. It was the bottom of the Iron Curtain that went from Berlin basically down to Trieste. And it was and is a city like no other. And Jan Morris found her most self in Trieste. James Joyce lived in Trieste for many years,
Oh,
and for 18 years, and they found there the sense of nowhereness that allows you to be your most self because you invest yourself in the place. And so we will get to As One, which I think is a masterpiece, in a moment. But tell me about the inspiration you find and draw from Fire Island and why you make it the place where you write.
um, oh, this is really, gosh, I think I need a sip of wine. I love talking with you because it turns into this like personal conversation. And it's no more an interview. It's two
No,
friends that have like some fabulous restaurant, some fabulous cheap restaurant where you know the food and you have to order this and we'll have a little bit more wine. And so it's wonderful that you asked that question, because no one asked me that question. And sometimes I'm very emphatic
Well,
about.
I'm a writer too, and I have my place, so I get that. Most writers have their place.
And the idea of nowhere, what was it? Nowhere?
Nowhereness.
Nowhereness. I was going to say Nowheresville. The idea of nowhereness is probably one of the most important things a writer can discover about themselves. Where is that place where there's no agenda and where everything in the world, the cloud, the sea, for me, the sea, always the sea, the sand, even a loud city. Berlin could be a nowhereness for you. I mean, it was for many writers. What is it about this place that is going to make you lose yourself, but also find yourself in your writing? And I have always written by the ocean, and always written by the ocean off season. I wrote probably most of my operas in Provincetown in January and February. I could go up there, I could find a cheap place, I could go for a long walk. Walking is extremely important. I could go for a 2-hour walk in freezing weather, and I could even go for 2 or 3 days and not speak to anyone. That's another quality for me, that there's too much noise in the world. And so I seek places where I can just listen to my thoughts, it's very hard to do in this society that we've created for ourselves. In the case of Fire Island, I have a history with Fire Island. Some of it's a little, I'm a gay man of a certain age, and I have a little bit of a history with Fire Island, but everyone immediately thinks that's what Fire Island is. It is not. There is a lot more to this place than the beautiful paradise that was created for gay sex in the 60s and 70s. There's so much more here, and especially off season. And my husband and I bought this small house here. He, bless him, identified early in me that I need to be by the ocean to work. I need to be able to walk for several hours to work. I need to have a little bit of a blank slate. The thing I love about the ocean is that there are pretty much only 2 colors. There's beige and blue, and there's like shades in between. And there might be a little burst of green. I could never work in a jungle. It's too noisy and there are too many colors. Interestingly, when I was working on an opera about Georgia O'Keeffe, Today It Rains, she found the same thing in Santa Fe. That was her nowhereness place. And she was working up in, oh God, what was the name of the lake? In upstate New York.
Upstate New York?
George.
Lake George.
She was there with, she was working at Lake George, and she wrote this famous line where she said, I can't work here. There's too much green. And I understand that. I think all writers bond on that. I was very lucky, Fred. I want to mention something. Years ago, a great performance artist named John Kelly recommended that I go to the MacDowell Colony. We're talking like 1990, and I never understood, like, why would I go somewhere and write? Going to the MacDowell Colony changed my life. It changed the way I look at myself as a writer. I was there in the winter because God knows they wouldn't give me a residency in the summer. I wasn't known or famous or even good enough probably at that point. They gave me a residency in the summer. I walked into my little cabin in the woods. It was snowing outside and there was a field, an empty field. Jane Kenyon, the poet, came up with such a beautiful line when she said, "The field was simplified by snow." I just love that. And I sat down and I just started crying because I'd never had the luxury of waking up, going to bed with, eating with, sleeping with the subject that you're working on. And once the MacDowell Colony did that it's actually now just called the MacDowell, they took away Colony. The MacDowell did that for me. I discovered what I needed as a writer. And now I find it myself by going to Fire Island and, and to Provincetown, to Cape Cod. it's crucial. I think it's really important for writers to find that.
It's what Virginia Woolf called a room of one's own.
Absolutely.
Do you have their television, radio, anything sound oriented apart from the sound of the ocean?
Well, I'm talking to you right now, so yes.
True. But I mean, do you engage it? In other words, obviously we all can activate these things if we want. When you write, do you have music on, for example?
Oh, you won't like the answer to that. The music I like to listen to when I'm writing is techno, which is now called EDM. I like it because it's stupid and it has energy and it keeps me humming. I can't listen to music with words, and I could never listen to opera because I'm actually going to listen. And with techno, it's just like background. I don't always put that on. I don't watch television. I mean, no one watches television anymore the way we used to watch television. But I go to sleep now with the sound of the ocean in my ears. I wake up with the ocean in my ears. And if it's not that, sometimes it's hard to sleep because I can't focus on what sound I love more. The wind through the pine trees here, the ocean, even just the silence. I've lived in New York so long that I prize silence so much now. It's a beautiful place. It's going to be strange because in a week or two, there will only be 4 ferries on the weekend only. So you're here for the weekend, and there are no stores, there are no bars. I can walk for 2 or 3 hours and not see a single person. But I like that. I've never been happier.
I want to point out for listeners who don't know, I've only been to Fire Island once in 1981.
1981, right.
And but if you look at the map of New York City, there is this Long Island, which is called Long Island, that extends east from the city for, I believe it's 120 miles. I'm not certain, but that's about 180, 190 kilometers. And on the southern part of Long Island is a very long series of barrier reefs and islands. And one of these sections in the middle is called Fire Island, but Fire Island has various beaches and communities on it. And it can only be reached from the mainland of Long Island by ferries. And so in a way, it's like my beloved Venice, that you cannot reach it by a bridge, you reach it by boat transportation. So already there's a degree of separation.
Yes.
That is remarkable. I remember from my visit there, which was in the summertime, there were deer everywhere.
Yeah.
There were not vehicles. There were little red carts that people would pull, little wagons, go to the store and do their shopping and pull it along a boardwalk that was then fronting on the beach. And I mention this in part because it was idyllic. I think that one would have to work there out of season because the blandishments in season are just too numerous. But I have a place that I've gone to since 1973 in Italy that is my private place. And I'm not even going to mention the name of the town, but it's on the Mediterranean. And now some people know it, but at the time that I first found it, it really was known just to local people. It's a fishing village. It has its own rhythms. The fishermen go out often late at night, and from my window, I can see their boats go out. These are little boats with the lights on the boat, and they fish overnight, and they come in the late morning, and they sell their fish at the dock. And the town only has 2 vehicles, an ambulance to take us to the hospital if we have to go, and a refrigerated truck that takes the fish that we don't buy to the nearby large city. And the fish are sold by the afternoon in the large city where I live close to. And where I live, it's not fancy at all, but what I have day and night are the sounds, the rather pulsing sounds of the Mediterranean Sea. and all I hear is that. And when
Mhm.
I first moved there, though I've never had a TV there. Um, I finally got a fax machine, but the power structure was not very good, and therefore it would go out. I do have an Italian cell phone, and I use that, but I'm able to separate from the world that way, even though, unlike you, I'm living in a town that has about 800 people.
Mhm.
And I go out for my morning walk. There's a cafe that I always stop at, and they know me as L'Americano, the American. And I will sit there for a morning. You might walk and gather your ideas. I sit there and gather my ideas just at the cafe with coffee and hearing the waves and occasionally looking at people and just keeping a pad there and writing things down when they come to me. And then I go to the dock, I buy fish, I take it home, I make lunch, I sit down and I write in the afternoon. And then, like all good writers, have a nap.
Yeah,
And then I
absolutely.
go out for the afternoon walk, sort of at dusk, and go to the bakery and buy bread for the evening and buy vegetables at the market, stop again at that cafe for another round of coffee. And then as the sun goes down, I come back to my place, I cook a meal, and then I write well into the night.
Mhm.
And I too, even in a town, don't talk to people sometimes apart from ordering the coffee and greeting the people in the shops and the saying buongiorno as we do. But otherwise, it really is that life. And I think that that's not a nowhereness for me. That's a somewhereness. I get what Jan
Mhm.
said about Trieste, but for me, it's a somewhereness in that it's my cradle, it's my structure, and not having to worry about all kinds of extraneous things, especially being hooked up to the internet and conversing with people, means that my mind can go to whatever I want to work on.
Mhm.
And it's such a thrilling sensation. I would imagine that with 38, 39 operas, 7 musicals, 5 song cycles, and 2 oratorios, you don't have writer's block.
Yes, of course I do.
How does writer's block happen? And how do you unblock it?
Oh gosh. Uh, well, yes, there are times when I have to tell myself you can't have writer's block because your deadline is in 2 weeks. Just get it done. Just get it done. Um, I would say for me, writer's block occurs when I haven't quite figured out the story. And I'm doing everything to not figure out the story. I'm going to rush forward and just write the words. Well, I have to figure out the story first. I'm not a writer who says, "Oh, just keep writing and let's see what happens when we get to the end." I need to know the end because I want all of my things, all of my plot, and all my characters to line up for that ending. And so, I am a writer who needs to know where he's going before he gets there. Um, I have been known to, I don't have anything up on my wall right now, but I will, when I get lost, I'll create a theme sentence and um, and then put that up on my wall. And when I get blocked, I go, this scene is just garbage. Something's, this is not working. And then I'll look up this sentence and go, yeah, because you're not supporting that. You're not, how does this nonsense that you've just written support that sentence? Um, yeah, I mean, the act two, Silent Night, was not easy to write because the screenplay was not helping me. And then I wrote a sentence that said that war is not sustainable when you come to know your enemy as a fellow human being. And when I put that sentence up, I said, okay, now every event in Act Two needs to be built off of that. Similar, even with The Shining, and everyone thinks The Shining is just this fantastic, great horror story. No, there's a real story there. The novel, there's a real character there in Jack Torrance. And once I figured out that Jack Torrance was suffering, Jack had been abused by his father, Mark Torrance. Um, and once I found that, I thought, okay, there's something in this. And I created a sentence for The Shining, which will sound ridiculous, but it was, generations of child abuse can only be ended by a very strong love. And everything in that opera relates to that sentence. That sentence is ridiculous. It's so simplistic and so like, well, duh, of course. But writers sometimes need to be reminded of that sort of light, that theme, that message, when they're struggling through the brambles of words.
And the dramatic implications of that, which I think millions of people listening, when they will listen to this, will feel the resonance, is that those generations of child abuse could be ended by a true love, by love, but only if you want to embrace and accept the love.
Absolutely.
Because there are so many people, whether in relationships, in job choices, and all kinds of decisions in life, reinforce the negativity that they've either learned or accepted or have had pounded into them, rather than break free. And we as viewers, whether it's of opera, film, theater, literature, etc., feel a release when we feel a character who breaks free.
Yeah.
Or can go
when you
free.
Can break free with music, which is opera, what is greater? What is greater? Because you not only have the logic of the story, but you have the emotion, the abstract emotion of the music. I mean, that's again why I think we like opera.
Here's a question I meant to ask you earlier, and then we're going to get to ask one. I've written one opera libretto, and I had an idea for another. The opera libretto I wrote was commissioned by National Public Radio, and it was to be a 58-minute opera because it would fit into an hour of National Public Radio. And I wrote it. I had in mind the kind of composer I wanted, but I didn't know who that composer would be. Once I submitted the libretto, I then explained that I heard Baroque music in this, even though it was set in New York in the year 2000. And I was referred to a composer named Anthony Newman in Connecticut, who wrote absolutely perfect music for the libretto that I had written. And he and I did not have any discussion. He wrote the music, it came back, and I wouldn't change a thing. He understood that there was one aria that had to have 41 thuds or attacks or shots, whatever you want to call them, but 41 points, and they had to come in a certain rhythm, and he got that without my telling him. And so I was very, very happy with what we produced. And our first day of rehearsal was scheduled to be September 11th, 2001.
Oh, fuck. Oh,
and and one of the stars was Carol Venice, a wonderful soprano. And we had a great cast, Richard Margis in a tenor, and wonderful cast. And it never came to pass because of that. And because the subject matter, which I can tell you about some other time, was just a little too raw for 9/11 and for the period right after 9/11. And we all came to the decision that maybe this can be revived in some way in the future as a history piece. But for now, it just was not the right piece. So that was my experience writing libretto, and I think it was first time lucky, but I don't know if I would do that again. But I have always had in my head another story. But my challenge is I cannot think of a composer who could write the music that I hear for that story. And that has always been the obstacle. I'm not saying that that person doesn't exist, but when I go to operas, I do constantly, I've never heard anything close to the music that I envision for the story. And that's unfortunate. I think maybe the modern idiom doesn't accommodate the story, even though it's a relatively contemporary story.
What are you looking for? What kind of, I mean, why can't, there are so many great composers.
Verdi.
And you know them all. You're looking for Verdi. You can find a Verdi.
Verdi had in his bones, I think, more than any opera composer, the sense of drama, getting to the essential, to the core of it, and letting the music do the work, and letting the conflict in the heart, in this case of a mother who politically stands one way and sees her daughter go the opposite way and knows that her daughter will pay for it, and wanting to interfere as a mother, but also wanting to stand by her own political convictions, which are frankly more my political convictions than that of the daughter. And it involved the atomic bomb long before operas such as Dr. Atomic were written. It was a story that I fashioned sort of in the early 1980s as being a very gripping opera. It was set in Vermont and in Washington, D.C. And I just have never come across the composer that could really make that work. Now it would be a history opera because it's set in Vermont in the early 1980s. But I mentioned that only to ask you in a roundabout way. You said to me that you study the music of the composers you're going to work with. Have you ever had an idea for a libretto where you don't yet know the composer, but know what you want to say as a librettist?
You're asking me to have a memory right now, which is depleted out here. That's another reason why I love Fire Island. Say the question again.
Have you ever had an idea for libretto, a story for an opera, or maybe a song cycle or a musical, but let's say an opera, where you feel it very strongly, you feel the characters, you know the development, you know that sentence, something you put above you, and what you're after, but you don't know the composer who would write it, or you can't picture which composer, the ones you've worked with, you would ask to write it? In other words, does the libretto just come forth on its own without knowing who the composer might be?
Yes, I've had ideas, and I even have a folder on my laptop of ideas. And there are probably one or two ideas there where I said, don't offer that to the composer yet. You don't, hold off. But the idea, but that also means that the idea is not ready. That I haven't really clarified in my mind what the complete idea is, because once that happens, I mean, this will sound so egotistical. I can find a composer. They may not want to work with me, but I'm very lucky right now in the sense that I can approach composers that I really admire and say, here's an idea. But if the idea is not quite clear in my mind, then I'm not ready to give it to a composer. Yeah, I can tell you a piece that I'm working on right now, My Own Country. It's an adaptation of Dr. Abraham Verghese' novel from 1994. And I met a composer about 6 or 7 years ago named Kamala Shankaram when I was mentoring at American Lyric Theater. And I loved her music. And then it hadn't even crossed my mind that she would be a great composer for this. She's South Asian, but that's the least important thing to me, actually, in this collaboration. It turns out that her father was a doctor who was an immigrant, and that's what this story is.
Yes.
That's the most important thing to me. And then also that we connected over this story. And I'm very excited to be able to finally work on that piece. I thought of it in 1995. So that's a long time ago. She's a great composer, and I can't wait for us to really work on it.
Let's go to As One.
Sure.
I think I read that Silent Night, which you've also written, is, along with a couple of operas by Jake Heggie, among the most performed contemporary operas.
Jake Heggie and Jean Shear.
Jean Shear, yes. Thank you for bringing in the librettist. And sometimes Jake
There
Hagee and
are
Terrence,
words, and there is a
yeah,
story, by the way.
and
Yeah,
sometimes Jake Hagee and Terrence McNally, the late
exactly. Yeah.
McNally. Um, but As One came a little later, but I think it's catching up very quickly as among the most performed operas. Um, I don't know if I told this to you, but when it premiered in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, I was asked to give a lecture before.
Oh, wow.
And so I studied the opera. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to know that I was studying your opera, because I wanted to come to my own
Right.
conclusions and I didn't want you to feel awkward. I think it's wonderful. So don't drink too much. Yeah, I think it's great. But um, it meant studying it in a very particular way, studying the libretto, studying the story. Would you briefly tell the story of the Hannahs and Laura Kaminsky, the composer, and Kimberly Reed?
Sure, and I really do need to mention that I co-wrote this libretto with Kimberly Reed, who is trans.
Yes.
And the development of As One is so strange and not like many other things I've worked on. Laura had an idea to write an opera about a trans person. Excuse me, she'd read an article in the Times about someone in New Jersey who had a family and everything like that. And I met her, we were adjudicating applications for Opera America. We immediately connected. She said, I'm working on this opera. I probably can't afford you. And which is such a hilarious thing to say because I'm very affordable. Um, and she said, I want you to meet someone that I have already engaged in the project, Kimberly Reed. But Kimberly's going to be doing the film. And if you and Kim get along, well, of course, Kim and I got along like way too well. And I asked him to write the libretto because I'm not trans. I know how to write a libretto. But the best part about Kim is that, not that she's trans, but that she loves to tell a good story. And we immediately bonded over that. We immediately started thinking about ideas. And one of the first things I said to her, I said, I'm sorry, but my default in writing is humor. And especially when there's something that is perceived as political, even though it's personal.
Mm-hmm.
Are you cool with that? And she said, oh my God, yes. We can be funny with Hannah. Hannah before and Hannah after, of course, as you know, as a character in As One. So it was just a serendipitous collaboration. Kim and I, there was a point where Laura was kind of involved in the libretto, and I said, you know what? I think Kim and I need to go off and just write this. Laura had never written an opera before. Kim had never written an opera before. And I said, let Kim and I just give some space. And Laura was very gracious about that. And 3 months later, we presented a libretto to Laura. Now, as you know, As One does not have a traditional narrative. It's basically a song cycle. And one of the reasons I made the decision to do it that way is because I thought it would show off Laura to her best advantage, to write something that is, because I wasn't sustaining, I wasn't seeing a longer arc in her music, but I was seeing brilliant flashes of storytelling. And so I think that the theatrical song cycle, or just a song cycle, would be the way to go with this. And gosh, the story of Hannah before and Hannah after. And by the way, it was Kim who came up. I came up with the name Hannah because I love the name, and also it's a palindrome.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I just love the name Hannah. And I suggested it. We were in Utah on a workshop. And it was really Kim who said, let's go with before and after. I think the original names were like man and woman. And what singer wants to put that on their resume, man, woman, in As One? Anyway, it's just the story of Hannah's emergence. I don't use transition because a transgender person is only realizing the person that they have always been. And nothing angers me more when I see advertising for As One. Fortunately, it hasn't happened in a while, where they say he was a she or she was a he and all that. It's garbage. You're not understanding the story if that's what you think. Yeah, and it's really about, it just traces Hannah's life from her childhood through her middle years to her self-realization in Norway. My favorite moment or the moment that I most connect with in As One is a song called To Know. And I can say, as a gay man growing up in a relatively conservative household, that moment when you are able to understand that in the world outside there are other people like you, that you are not alone, that there are gay people, there are lesbian people, there are transgender people. I mean, you could even extend that to race sometimes, is one of the greatest things you can discover. And it's such a relief. It's because when you grow up, like as a gay man, as I did, you think that you're crazy and that everything you're doing is wrong and awful. I was baptized Catholic. Fortunately, I never went any farther than that. But you're taught that it's wrong. And when you're taught even to just know that there are other people out there means so much. I mean, that's why the idea of coming out is very important. I was recently arguing with someone about the writer Thornton Wilder. That I wish that he was gay.
I know, I studied with him.
Yeah. Oh, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. So he was gay. Had I known doing Our Town that Thornton Wilder was gay, it would have made things just a little bit easier for me. And even about Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland and all these people. And when you take away that, and I'm not saying, I don't care. I really don't care who anyone sleeps with. It's so not important to me. But if you could just know that as a young person, that there is this artistic hero that you have, might have had interest in the same sex. If you have interest in the same sex, it just makes it easier. That's all. Boy, I'm sorry, I went on a rant.
That's okay. So let me tell you about Thornton Wilder, and then we'll get back to As One, because I want to tell you specifically a couple of things that really changed my life in As One. I'm not a trans person, but as a writer, you really grabbed me with that particular libretto. I studied at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I went there. People thought it was a slightly unusual choice. If you know the United States, it's a big Midwestern university, a lot of beer drinking and bacchanalia and so on. Also very politically, very progressive.
Yeah,
but
it is.
They had a wonderful professor there named Gilbert Helmsley, who was the leading teacher in the United States, not only of lighting, but of theater and arts management.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I wanted to study with Gilbert. They also had a very good communication school, the best European history department in the country, good languages, and things that I could use for 2 or 3 years to prepare for a career in opera before I moved to Italy and did that stuff. And Thornton Wilder lived in Wisconsin. Wow. And soon before he died, he was invited by the theater department to do a semester and a series of productions called Wilder and Wilder. Wow. And we did The Skin of Our Teeth. I was in. They did Our Town. I was not in it. But then they did a one-act play, Mark, that if you don't know it, I think you could make a great opera out of this play, called the Pullman Car Hiawatha.
I know about it. It's fantastic. Okay. It's great.
So Thornton Wilder directed the Pullman Car Hiawatha.
Wow.
And it required one character who spoke German. And while my German is not good enough to read Goethe and recite it and be a leader singer, it was good enough to speak in German in the play in Wisconsin. Yeah. And he told me about this character, and I don't want to share it with the audience because if you write the libretto, you can ask me about this character. Oh. But he was the conductor. He was the railway conductor for this Pullman car, which was a carriage attached to a train that traveled in a mysterious place that had passengers. It was a bit like Dinner at Eight in that we had all these people put together in one space interacting, and there was one outsider the way the narrator is in our town, except that this narrator did it in German.
Wow.
And for reasons that I think look at it, Mark. I think you might find it interesting.
I'll look at it again. I also love The Long Christmas Dinner, which was turned into an opera. Yeah.
Yeah. So we didn't know that Thornton Wilder was gay at that time. We knew that Professor Helmsley was, but we didn't know that Thornton Wilder was. But back to As One. When I prepared my talk, I gave it, and I used a word that I didn't realize was not a good word. I said transgendered.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's not a verb. Yeah.
And I was politely corrected, and I apologized, and I then said transgender. But what it activated in me, that I've always cared about and thought about as a writer and as a reader of writing, is the degree to which word choice can either lead or follow in terms of the mores of a time, in terms of the sensibilities of a time, so that there are now words that we do not use because they're profoundly offensive, but in my view, nonetheless exist as words and as signifiers that we occasionally have to use, not because they're good, but specifically because they're bad and they're evil. Similarly, there are political movements and social movements in which new words are created, but I don't want to say have common acceptance, but don't have common comprehension. So that when we use a pronoun about a person who is transgender, or sometimes we say gender fluid, you often use, not you, one often uses they. And I guess I have a problem with they because it implies plural more than one.
Right.
And I think one does not have to be transgender or gender fluid to have multiplicity in themselves. And therefore, I would love to find a different word than they to express that. Also because it can get in the way of understanding.
Absolutely.
Especially when opera or literature is translated from one language to another. And if we all commonly accept they to mean one particular thing, then fine. But if it's not there, what we are creating, I believe, is an obstacle to connection rather than a connection. When you write libretti, in this case As One, but really all the language that you use in your different libretti, which are set in different times and places and values, and you've written about African Americans, you've written about all kinds of people, and language is always different. To what degree do you want to be a leader or a follower or neither in your selection of words? In other words, do you want to embrace a new word? Do you want to reject a bad old word?
Oh, I can't make that decision. The story will tell me that. Yeah, I mean, you know, the opening line of Stonewall is cocksucking dyke. And I don't like the word dyke. Cocksucking is hilarious because it was, and of course the character makes fun of it. I'm sorry, I hope this is probably too vulgar for your audience.
No.
Or maybe not vulgar enough. But I made the decision, that was my first, and that was based on a real experience of a lesbian friend of mine who, like construction workers, she was walking down the street and someone called her that. And she said, you don't get it. That's and that stayed with me because it was the power of language to hurt.
Yes.
and yet, I mean, I co-op bad words in gay language. You know, I'll say, "Oh God, what a queen," and it's hurtful, but it's also helpful in a way. Gosh, you know, I wrote an oratorio about the Underground Railroad, and about slaves.
Sanctuary Road, which is magnificent.
Thank you. I'm very proud of Sanctuary Road. Just got a Grammy nomination.
Congratulations.
And that was written, but that's based on the writings of William Still.
Yes.
And there could have been a decision at one point to use some very bad language about Black people. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that because I think that this oratorio is in a way aspirational, that it is about a world in which those words are not used to really hurt people and to keep people down. And I don't care if Black people want to use those words, and you know, that's not my job to think about that. My job is to think about how brave and how strong these people were who escaped freedom, and that those words are not part of that for me in this story. It's not my responsibility to I think it's kind of bogus when people say, I'm an activist and an artist. You're an artist, you're writing. If you're writing true, then you are an activist. If you truly are an activist, then I'm sorry, you're not at your desk thinking of these characters, you're out there leafleting something. So don't tell me you're an activist and an artist. Just be a fucking, excuse me, just be an artist. Just be an artist. That is enough. That makes you an activist already.
No.
And this new movement in opera and theater about like, oh, you have to be an activist and all that. No, we were always activists. Look at the history of our work. You're only claiming that to put it on your resume and to sell yourself. My God, look at what was created. Orson Welles, like all those people. They were
Verdi.
Verdi.
Orson Welles, who I like, but
activist.
Verdi, but Monteverdi, even going way further back.
Exactly.
Monteverdi,
but he would not put activist on his resume.
No.
I'm a composer. I am writing about human beings, and so therefore I am an activist. And I'm sorry for we're cool?
Still here, Mark.
Okay. Yes. I just find this trend of like of writing about a political thing. It's kind of nonsense to me. Write about the story and let the political thing come through that. That's what your job is as a writer. Otherwise, just be a speech maker.
How do you feel about a word that's getting a lot of usage now, storyteller?
Well, it's fine. I use it all the time when I have to. I think I use it in grant applications and
yeah, but I find it's become sort of a euphemism and a buzzword that one often sees, but either we are all storytellers or some of us do it for a living.
But you know where that's coming from, Fred? It's coming from the denigration of artists. It's coming from, like, we always have to find ways to defend ourselves. You know, and especially now during the pandemic, when like, oh, is music necessary? Yes, music is necessary. A vaccine is also necessary, but music is really necessary. Art is really necessary because it's about our higher selves, our better selves. And if we need something about our better selves, I can't think of a time in my lifetime when we need something about our better selves more than now. But the reason people come up with things like storytellers is because we suddenly have to justify ourselves. We have to fill out grant applications. And so he's a brilliant storyteller. I've used storyteller myself all the time. I wish I didn't have to. I think it's nonsense. I'm just doing my job, really. I wish a composer could just say, I'm just doing my job. I wish a librettist, I wish all of us could just say, we're just doing our job. We're workers. That's all.
I'm going to include myself. We are workers in this.
You should.
But I can tell you that very famous, very wonderful opera singer, one of my very favorites, always said to me, I worked with her a lot, that she was doing her job.
Mhm.
And she's one of the greatest singers. But I always felt that I wanted her to say that she felt a connection to her job and a sense of fulfillment from the characters that she played and the music that she sang so beautifully. But to her, it was really, at least the way she expressed it, more about showing up for rehearsal, being on time, being prepared with her music, knowing her blocking, being the right size for her costume, and all the things that are in the details involved in putting on an opera. But I've known many other singers who bring a sense of artistic mission to what they do. And this particular singer, who I really love, but with her, it was always very matter of fact. And I wanted to sometimes engage her in a conversation as friends, not in a public setting,
Yeah.
about her characters, about the music, and she wouldn't have it. And yeah, it was odd to me. I wanted this person who inspires me so
Mm.
to give me a sense that she feels what she's doing, and she never quite did, except when she put her foot on the stage, when
Oh.
she was brilliant.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas many other people are artists to the nth degree in a wonderful way. I can name many: Leonie Rieseneck, Krista Ludwig, Hildegard Behrens, John Vickers, and on and on and on and on. Leontine Price, Shirley Verrett, many, 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 who are artists. And that's a term that we use. This other singer, who I'm not naming because she's a very private person, is definitely an artist of that caliber, but just brought a different sense of mission to her work, as she
Mm.
described it. I think it's so hard to be a creative person anyway, and harder to get your work recognized, done,
Mhm.
understood, done well, actually, which is not a given when you are in a collaborative art form such as opera or cinema or theater or dance. Even when you write a book and the book is published and has a publisher, that's collaborative to some degree as well. And so I commend you, I admire you, because you keep your eye on the prize being expression and understanding. And I don't, that's the prize I see you working toward, because your range of subject matter, your tendency to inject comedy where comedy doesn't seem to belong, your humanity in your characters is what I grasp. And it's the same humanity that I find in my beloved Verdi. You could find it in Mozart, you could find it in many, many places, but you connect, Mark. I mean, I know that's also sort of a strange word that we don't like to use too much, but there's something about the way you create characters and help structure operas that make opera immensely invigorating and intoxicating in contemporary times.
Well, that. I don't know how to handle um, stuff like that, but
And I haven't had
thank
any
you.
wine.
I know, and I've had too much, and so that's very kind. But the only thing that I will say, because I have to say something, is that I really care about my audience. I care about them before. I haven't read critics for like 3 or 4 years. I gave up. I just thought, these idiots, like, and I'm so glad to see some of them getting fired, like that Washington Post person. It's like you're not doing your job. You're not helping the art form. You're hurting the art form. And so it's sort of like I said, I don't need verification from you. The audience is verification enough. And I stopped reading them, and it's one of the best decisions that I could have ever made, because I don't really care about what they say. I don't. I it's nice to get nominated for prizes, but that's not why I'm writing. I'm writing because I want the audience to care about something. And I'm writing an opera because music makes us care more. That's it. That's my artistic statement. And yeah, and you know, I think critics have torn me apart before because I care so much about the audience. I don't care. I have a good career. I like what I'm writing. I get to write things that I want to write about. I get to collaborate with composers I adore, like Paul Moravec, like Kevin Putz, like Laura Kaminsky. I love these. Paolo Prestini. I haven't even mentioned Paolo. And also, you know, I hate that when I mention one composer, I can think of 20.
Missy Mazzoli is another one you've worked with.
Yeah, we wrote a mini opera. Mitzi
There's no mini operas.
Doesn't need to work with me. She's working with Royce, and Royce is brilliant, and they have such a great collaboration.
Royce Fabric, yep.
Yeah, and so, you know, she doesn't need me. But she's tremendous. I mean, there's so many tremendous composers and librettists out there. You know, Jake Heggie and I wrote a Christmas choral piece years ago, like maybe 8 years ago. I think he's tremendous. He's one of the reasons that I started writing opera. When I saw Dead Men Walking, I went, that's what I want to do. I was working in musical theater, and I said, but I can do this. And therefore, music is more important than is in musical theater. So, yeah.
Stephen Sondheim, speaking of musical theater, but also I mentioned him right up there. He would recoil right up there with Berlioz and Wagner in that he does words and music. Mm-hmm. And I think you described him to me once as a playwright who works in music. Mm-hmm. And there are many people who adore every word, every syllable that he's written. There are people who don't. Mm-hmm. He is an artist who always takes chances. Mm-hmm. He is an artist who works in many genres of musical theater, and it's not easy to describe someone who has written Gypsy, the libretto, and West Side Story, and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and arguably my favorite musical, Follies, but also Company, A Little Night Music, Sweeney Todd, Assassins, mm-hmm. many, many more. Merrily We Roll Along, Pacific.
Sunday in the Park with George, yeah.
Sunday in the Park with George, and Into the Woods. I mean, the accumulation of masterpieces that he has given us, and he's 90, is stunning, but also there's nothing else like him. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are people who say Gilbert and Sullivan for the cleverness of the music, but I don't think so at all, at all.
And Steve hates Gilbert and Sullivan. And
I would imagine. But I've heard people say it, that their fascination with the words is similar to the fascination with the words in Sondheim. And there are volumes of Sondheim lyrics that are published without the music, just to read the words. Tell me about his influence on you as a writer.
Well, I've said this so many times. I mean, like, he was everything for me. I never studied opera because I grew up in a family, we didn't listen to opera. That was some European art form in a foreign language that, you know, that was way too fancy for mm-hmm. my family. But we did listen to musicals, of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and, you know, we had the Sound of Music soundtrack and everything like that. This is probably a little too psychologically motivated, but I remember watching the documentary about the making of Company on television with my mother, and my mother loved it, and I decided to buy it for her birthday, for the recording, you know, with the bright magenta cover and the orange and everything, and I think my mother loved Elaine Stritch. I think it was just like, oh, there's a woman who could tell it like it is. And we bonded over that. I think it was like it was a very much a bonding between a gay son and a mother. Anyway, I bought that for her, and then I started listening to it, and I went, "Oh, this is unbelievable! It's so vibrant and adult and cool, and not like the musical theater that I had been listening to, which at that point had felt a little bit irrelevant." And I'm not denigrating Rodgers and Hammerstein or anyone who came before, but there was something about Sondheim that spoke to us now. And I'm going to go ahead many decades when I saw Sweeney Todd in the theater with my friend John Raver, who's still around and we're still friends. And we both sat there and we watched Sweeney Todd on Broadway, and it was with Angela Lansbury and
George.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I went, this is what I want to do. I had already figured out that I wanted to be a theater lyricist. But the way that turned musical theater into opera, that convergence, that's when I knew that I wanted to do this. It took me a few years before I really figured it out. Mm-hmm. His work is, and there are so many composers and so many librettists who would feel the same way. Jake Heggie has dedicated Moby Dick to Steve Sondheim. Paul Morveck and I dedicated The Shining to Steve Sondheim. Yes, I can look at lyrics and go, God, I hate that lyric. I hate the rhyme just ash and mustache from Little Night Music. Stuff like that, where you can sense that he's forcing it. He doesn't care that I feel that way, but that does not in any way make his contribution to opera the lesser, the Frank lesser. Sorry. Mm-hmm. It's, I've spoken about this many times. His influence means everything to me, and he gave me a prize for my lyrics in 1990. The Ed Kleban Foundation Award, and it changed my life. And
Ed Kleban, who wrote the lyrics for a chorus line.
Yes.
Yes.
Which are great lyrics, by the way.
They are.
And he died of stomach cancer, and he created a foundation. And as I am doing for librettists, called the Campbell Opera Librettist Prize, it's going to be announced next week. You're getting an exclusive, Fred.
So tell us now. Opera America.
It's what?
With Opera America.
With Opera America, yeah. I decided, there are no prizes out there for librettists. I have to get going soon. Okay. Sorry, I have to get a ferry to go back to the city. But
all right.
There are no prizes for opera librettists out in the business right now. And last year, to be frank, I was looking at my will, and I was thinking, what do I want to? How do I want this art form to go forward? And I decided I wanted to create a prize for librettists. I've fortunately been successful in a number of operas of mine, The Revolution of Steve Jobs and The Shining and Silent Night, and as one have created enough money where I could create a foundation. It's not as much money as I wish I could give to librettists, but it's going directly into their pocket. It's not going through an organization or anything like that. It is really, it's my way of saying librettists are really important to this business. Mm-hmm. Let's look at how we can elevate them.
What time is your ferry?
It is at 5 o'clock, so I have to leave in about 3 or 4 minutes. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I should have told you.
Last question. We have a dear friend in common, Roberto Scarcella Perino. He is a wonderful composer and teacher. He's at NYU's Casa Italiana Zedili Marimo, where I lead a course on Italian opera. You have just done something with Roberto called The Sweet Silence in Cremona. Tell us about it.
Yeah, sure. Roberto and I were friends in 2006, and he's a wonderful soul. I really do adore him. We had been trying to figure out a thing to work on together, and I knew he wanted to work on a comedy. And gosh, I don't know, maybe it was 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I read an article in the New York Times about that the mayor of Cremona had created a moratorium on sound because they were recording the Stradivarius.
I read that. Yep.
Yeah, in the
Mhm.
city. And so he decided there can't be any sound. And I thought, this is the most beautiful idea. And then I thought, this is a great premise for an opera, which is all about sound and noise. And also for a comedy, because in a comedy, you look for the thing that prevents people from doing what they want to do. And usually in comedy, it's an obsession. And comedy arises from that wall that stops someone from getting to what they're doing. And so I texted or emailed Roberto and I said, I think I have an idea for us. And I told him the idea and he said, that's so easy. I can just write one rest. It's silence. That Roberto and I laugh so hard. It's a great collaboration. Anyway, I said, okay, well then I'll find another composer. I was joking because I knew he was right for it. And then I came up with a story about an apartment building that's next to this museum where they're recording these violins. And every single person in the apartment building has a reason to say something loudly. Like one woman is pregnant and she's very pregnant and she thinks she's going to have a baby. Well, you can't be silent when you're going to have a baby. And yeah, I wrote the libretto. And it's been a lot of fun. Roberto and I, he's a great, forgive me, storyteller, musical storyteller.
And a great chef.
I know, he's an amazing cook.
Fabulous cook.
Oh my God, I've cooked for him and it was not fun. It was not fun because, God, I think I made what is the ice called?
Granita.
Yes, I made a granita for him, a grapefruit granita. And him being Italian was just like, this
Sicilian.
Sicilian, even Sicilian, yes, even more important. And I was so hurt because I thought I had done something, decent, but I'm not a good cook. He is a great cook, as are you.
Yep. Mark, we could go on for hours, but as you said at the beginning, there is a virtue in brevity. And yes. There's a boat that's leaving for New York. I couldn't resist
That was brilliant. That was brilliant.
And don't forget your dog. Thank you so much, my friend. You can't leave without the dog.
Okay,
thank you,
Fred,
Mark.
I just want to thank you. You're such a joy to talk with, and I hope we can do it again soon. And just, I love you, and I love what you do. So thank you.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.
I will do my best. Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.